So we are continuing our study in Genesis, and we're going to start looking this evening at this section of Genesis chapter 5, verse 1 to, and then chapter 6, verse 8. Just to remind you, it's been a while since we've been in Genesis. The book of Genesis obviously was written by Moses. We know that. And also Moses wrote the other four books of the Pentateuch. And as we've been going through Genesis, we just need to remind ourselves all the time that it is intended as an introduction to the books that follow. That's so important. We remember that. Genesis, if you like, gives us a narrative of the beginning of the universe and the beginning of the history of the people of Israel. And so what Genesis is doing is really stressing the story of Israel from Adam to Abraham, and then from Abraham to Noah, from Noah to Jacob, from Jacob to Joseph, and then all the way through the Old Testament, we pick up other books that pick up the story, pointing us all the way to the Messiah. So that we need to keep that in mind. We also need to remember that Moses wrote Genesis not for us as such, but for the children of Israel in the wilderness. That's very important because this is a generation that left the land of Egypt and needed the guidance of Moses, right? We must keep remembering that really to understand the message of the book. Why did God save the people of Israel out of Egypt? That's an important question, isn't it? Well, it is so that they would worship him as the one true God, and so that they would live under his rule, if you like, and under a new covenant relationship. I mentioned that, so I just keep remembering that the theme, if you like, of Genesis is about this covenant that God had established with Israel through Moses. And this covenant effectively established Israel as a theocracy, a nation ruled by God for the sake of the world. So if you like, Genesis introduces the people of Israel to the rest of the law of God that they are meant to follow, and it's explaining really the nature and character of this God who has so graciously delivered them out of the land of Egypt to be his people. And as we go through Genesis, we also see that actually it is showing us the place of human beings in God's creation. And most importantly, Genesis explains what is sin, what is the nature of sin, how did sin come about, and what are the consequences of sin. And also, what is the plan of God's salvation for us? How does God plan to deal with the issue of sin? All those answers are in Genesis, right? But the other thing we need to remember, as I'm just giving you this quick background to it, is that we need to remember that Genesis is also meant to, if you like, to give the people of Israel a sense of their place in the world, right? As they begin this new life. So they are leaving Egypt, right? They haven't entered the promised land, and they have this book of Genesis. And it's really meant to show them that, look, you are the chosen people of Yahweh, the creator of the universe. You are his vehicle of grace in the world. You've been chosen because you're the children of Abraham, right? God has brought you into this unique relationship with him because of his grace. Though you have been slaves, right, in Egypt, your destiny actually is not a small thing. It's a big thing because God has saved you and brought you to himself. So I hope that just gives you a bit of background to what's happening in Genesis. And then I guess we could ask the question is that what is the message of Genesis? So when you are reading the Bible, whether it's Genesis or Leviticus or whatever you're reading, it's always good for you to step back and ask yourself, what is the message of this book? And so I would summarize the message of Genesis as simply this, and we summarized it before. Our good God made us so that we can live with him in his world, but we rebelled against God. But instead of God giving up on us, God preserved the family line through the people of Israel to usher in the Messiah who was to come, an offspring of Eve, who will come to save us from sin and come to crush the serpent and effectively make us live with God again. So do you see, that's essentially the story. That's at the heart of Genesis. So at the heart of Genesis is Genesis 3 verse 15, right? If you turn to that, just to remind you of that. Genesis 3 verse 15, where God, on page 3, God curses, cursing the serpent, really. He's addressing the serpent, and he says this on page 3. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and our offspring. he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So that's the heart of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 15 there. God is promising our mother Eve there that one day he's going to send a deliverer to crush the serpent. And this deliverer will come through the community that God preserves. And so the story of Genesis is about God preserving the line of the Messiah, right? That's what it's about. And he's doing that through Israel. And of course, this line is the line of Jesus, isn't it? Right? So the line of Jesus takes us all the way back to Adam. And so we've been in Genesis now for 35 studies. So this is the 36th study in Genesis. We've been studying it at some detail. We've already looked at Genesis chapter 1 to 4. We've seen how God created the world perfect. We've seen how God created perfect human beings. We've seen how they have rebelled against God. And we've seen how they have been expelled from Eden. And we saw that actually when God expels them from Eden, two lines emerge, if you like, two groups of people. There's one group which is really led by the descendants of Cain, and they are very godless, and they're really trying to make a name for themselves. We saw that in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17 to 24. We said they follow the way of the serpent. They follow the way of sin. They're trying to build the city of man, right? And there's another line, the line of Seth, right? This is the line of people with Adam, Seth, and then the descendants of Seth. This is the line where Enoch is. This is the line of Methuselah. This is the line we've been reading about in Genesis chapter 5. They are trying to live for God, and they worship the one true God. And actually the story of Genesis, we might say, or the story of the Bible, is a clash of these two lines, we might say, right? And the world either belongs to one of the lines spiritually or the other, right? So, today we're beginning to look at Genesis chapter 5, verse 1 to chapter 6, verse 8. That's the section, right? And really the purpose of this section really is to show us how God kept a people who worshipped him. How this line of Seth, if you like, was kept by God. And God has kept it so that he could usher in the Messiah down the line. So the names I've been reading, I know we started off, I was reading a lot of names. You may usually, when you read these, you skip over them, right? You're like, what are all these names? Actually, you're going to see over the next 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks, is really wonderful names. We're going to look at the life of Enoch. We're going to look at Methuselah a bit more, and Noah. They are good names, but even when you don't dive into the detail, the names are important because they are showing us the good news of the faithfulness of God as he continues to keep the story of Seth and these people going so that the Messiah would come. So and ultimately we read from Adam to Noah because we see how God then has kept this line. I hope that makes sense, right? This evening I just wanted to focus on verse 1 to 2 of chapter 5. Let me read that again. This is the book of the generations of Adam. By the way, just the fact that it says the book shows that these names would have been written down, not merely passed on orally. That's very important, that we are reading. Moses is drawing from written material even as he puts together these names. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. I want to just this evening just to pause really and think about those two verses, because those two verses really, what they're doing is they're reminding us of initially the good creation of man, right? Before Moses gives us a full record of names that show how faithful and wonderful God is, he wants us to remind us actually, even when God created us, he created us good. This is a good God who created us. So I want us to focus on that. And so I've got the Bible study this evening just to spend 25 minutes really explaining this text a little bit more. I have called it the good creation of man, right? And there are 4 things I just want to draw to your attention that Moses is reminding us about how our good God created us from these 2 verses. The first thing I think we see in this passage is that God created man in his image. Moses really wants us to remember that. God created man in his image. We see this in verse 1, isn't it? When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. We said when we looked at that likeness and image, right, are broadly meaning the same thing. Because you remember from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, when God creates man, he says, let us make man in our image after our likeness, right? And so immediately in Genesis, we get the idea that actually image and likeness, they're interchangeable, right? They broadly mean the same thing, but they have different emphasis. I'm not going to ask. I know it's a Bible study, so I probably could ask, what do you think they may mean? But let me just quickly explain this to you, right? Because you notice this also verse 3. Did you notice in verse 3? When Adam had lived for 130 years, he fathered a son in what? In his own likeness, after his image, and named himself. Again, we see the interchangeability, if you like, of these two ideas, right? So, what does the word image mean? Right? Well, the word image in Hebrew is selem. It comes from a Hebrew root word which means to carve out or to cut, right? So an image is something that is cut out to represent something, like a figurine. We discussed that. Think of Nebuchadnezzar, right? He makes an image of himself, right, to represent him, right? So this idea of an image is something that represents something, right? Likeness is from the Hebrew demuth, which D-E-M-U-T-H, if you're writing that down. It comes from a root word that means to be like, not a copy of something, and not a copy of the same thing, but to be like that, if you like, right? In other words, man is created not just to represent God or stand in the place of God. He is intended in some way to function in a way that is like God, right? Without being God. Does that make sense? He is a representation and reflection of God. Man represents God by reflecting God. He is not God, he is like God, right? But not God. We mirror God. We are not God. If you like, so to speak, a human being is the word I used when we looked at that verse in the past is theomorphic, right? And that is to say, God created us to be like God so that God can communicate himself to us. He made us in a way that is like him so we can relate to him and we can point the rest of creation to God. I hope that makes sense. So, being made in the image of God, of course, is fundamentally what makes us human. So, the world usually asks, what does it mean to be human? Well, to be human is to be made in the image of God, right? That's the most human thing about us. This is what makes human beings special. This is why we are over and above everything else. We are not like animals, right? Because we are made in God's image. We are the pinnacle of God's creation because we are made in his image. And of course, the image of God in man means God created man in such a way that man alone represents God, and he is created in such a way that man alone reflects or mirrors God's being and activity in the world. Just a question before to ask you, in what way do you think we mirror or represent God? What immediately comes to your mind if you think about us mirroring and representing God? This is a random question. In what way would you say we mirror and represent God? Anyone?
We have this gift of being able to create.
Yeah. Yeah.
A painting or something like that. We have that ability to create.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Yeah. We have the ability to create, right? So because we share, mirroring and representing God means we share the same nature and quality as God. So God is a creator, and therefore God has made us, he's given us the capacity to create. God is spirit, we are spiritual beings. God has a mind and ability to choose, we also have a mind and ability to choose, right? God is good, loving, and truthful, we are created with these qualities as well, right? And being made in the image of God means also that we have the responsibility to act in this world in the way that God himself would act, right? We are his deputies, right? God has given us dominion to rule the world as God rules the universe. Now, of course, human beings have rebelled against God, right? Since God created us, right? So people sometimes ask the question, does that mean we are no longer bearing the image of God. No, the answer is we still carry the image of God because the image of God was given to us as an act of grace. We didn't earn the image of God. It was given to us as an act of grace. What sin has done to the image of God in us is to deface it. That is to say, we still possess the gifts and talents and capacities which God created us with, right? But we now use these gifts, right, in a way that are below their potential and also in a sinful and disobedient way. So the image of God remains in us, but it is defaced, right? Now, the wonderful news of the gospel is that Christ has come, isn't it? One of the reasons why Christ has come is to renew the image of God in us. Colossians chapter 3. He has come so that those who trust in him would bear the image of God afresh, so to speak, and that image will then be perfected in the age to come. You may think of the image of God in man in 4 states. You may remember I mentioned this when we did Genesis 1. We think of the image of God in 4 states. It is original in Genesis 1. It is ruined in Genesis 3. It is renewed in the sanctifying work in the children of God. And then what? It is perfected, right? 4 states: original, ruined, renewed, perfected. Right? Perfected in the age to come. Now, the point of Genesis chapter 5, verse 1, is to remind us that the goodness of this goodness of God in creating us in his image, and this truth that we are created in the image of God is meant to make us thankful, isn't it? Thankful to God, and the fact that we are made in God's image should shape how we live every day. Okay? So as the children of Israel were studying this passage, if you like, listening to Moses' teaching in Genesis, it was meant really to cause them to be thankful that they have been made in the image of God. And that should be our response even for us here. And it should actually affect us in 4 ways, I would say briefly. Being made in God's image should affect how we relate to God. Because what that means is that it means that we can relate to God because we are created to reflect and mirror God, right? It means we are not the final reference. We should never make our lives to be about us, they're about him. By the way, it also means sin is serious. Why is sin serious? Well, what is sin? Sin is defiling the image of God. Sin is committed by image bearers. Sin is a refusal to be human. It is a desecration of the image of God that God created us to be. And it should cause us to truly weep. The other thing it does is that the second thing is that it affects how we see ourselves, right? So being in the image of God means we are of God. What I mean by that is that we don't define ourselves. God defines us because we bear his image, right? So self-definition, making ourselves to be who we are, like the world wants us to be, is very burdensome, isn't it? Our identity actually is that we belong to God, and it is God who defines who we should be in the world because we bear his image. And so just remembering that means that it prevents us from thinking too little of ourselves. There's a lot of self-pity in our society at the moment. People are looking at their lives and they say, And as Christians we can get into that as well. Think, what is my life up to? I won't amount to anything. Actually, no, you are made in the image of God. And if you remember that, it guards against self-pity, regardless of what's going on in your life. But also it guards against pride. So it guards against self-pity and guards against pride, right? We are extremely valuable before God, right? But we are not God, right? And so we need to live as people who are humble before God. So it affects the way we think of ourselves. It also affects the way we relate to other people. That's the third thing, right? So murder is evil. Why is murder evil? Well, because it kills people who bear the image of God. Right? Where do human rights come from? Well, they come from the fact that we are made in the image of God. Right? So do you see how this truth really grounds the way we relate to one another? But also it affects how we as believers actually witness for God in the world. Right? We need to remember whenever we're sharing the gospel with anyone else that we are ministering to image bearers of God, and we're ministering to people therefore who have this image of God in them, but that image has been defaced by sin. And they are longing for that image to be renewed and perfected. So it really gives us good points of context when we are sharing the gospel. But the other thing it does is that when we're sharing the gospel, we are talking to people who are thinking contrarily to what God says they should be, right? Every worldview tries to frame humanity as an image of something. If not God, it's some other aspect of creation. That's what every worldview does. And this passage, therefore, is in the Bible to help us live in the world in such a way that we are rejecting everything that's contrary to the truth of God and really anchoring our thoughts about ourselves in the way God tells us to be. Because the world is saying the opposite. So, for example, what does consumerism say about human beings? You know, what we just had over Christmas. the shopping and buying, that frenzy. What does that say about human beings? Well, it's saying that we're just material needs. We can affirm, but as Christians, we can affirm, yeah, we have material needs, but I'm not my shopping, right? Right? I have a need to have a house, but I'm not a house, right? The things I own are not what defines me. And so what defines me is that I'm made in the image of God. We think about the LGBTQ, right? What does the LGBTQ movement say about human beings? If you ask them, what are human beings according to the LGBTQ? Well, their answer is that we are our sexuality. Welcome, we're in Genesis 5. We are Genesis 5, verse 1 to 2. The LGBTQ would say we are our sexuality, right? But this passage in the Bible challenges that, right? It says our sexuality is important, right? As we shall see in a moment, God has made us male and female, but we are more than that, right? So really remembering this truth really changes who we are. So that's the first thing I just wanted us to draw attention to this, is that God created man. The first thing Moses wants us to understand in Genesis 5, verse 1, is that God created man in his image. Is that clear? Is there anything that I've said that you don't understand from that? Okay? Right. Yeah. Yeah, so go on. Yeah. So I guess, well, what I mean is that the LGBTQ or even some other ideologies, they would see us purely through the lens of our biology, right? They would see us, you're a woman. Even feminism does that. You're a woman, so you're just a woman. Some other views now of masculinity would be like man, right? But the Bible shows us no. Even our gender actually is not what ultimately defines us. Strangely enough. What defines us is the fact that we are image bearers. That's the most fundamental thing, right? And so, yeah. So there's a sense in which being a woman defines you, but biblically it's being an image bearer that defines you. And of course that includes you being a woman, if you know what I mean, right? So it doesn't exclude that, but it is more than that, right? Okay, thank you. That's very, very helpful. Well, the second thing we learn here quickly, sort of running through this quickly, is that God created man in his image, and secondly, God created man as a relationship, right? And I'll just talk about this fairly quickly. We see that in verse 2, isn't it? Genesis 5, verse 2. When God created man, he made them in his likeness, in the likeness of God, male and female, he created them, right? So the point of verse 2 is that man is created as a relationship, male and female. And that is to say, man and woman, right, are images of God separately and images of God together. So the image of God has this amazing quality to it that it is both diverse and one. Like it's one and two, right? It has a bi-unity to it, we might say, right? There is a unity in diversity to the image of God. And that shouldn't surprise us, because where else have we come across that? God himself, isn't it? God is three persons in one. There is a triunity to God. There is unity and diversity. So it's not a surprise that when he creates us, we are created with that diversity as well, right? So, but fundamentally here, we are created as a relationship, isn't it? And being created as male and female reminds us that we are social beings. We are created to live with each other. we are truly living human lives when we are living in community with each other. And there are fundamental practical ways being in contact with the community with each other helps us to live truly human lives. When we looked at Genesis chapter 1, I told the story about the wild boy of Aveyron, isn't it? That boy was left in the forest of Lacan in 18th century France, who, after he was found, he had been found actually living as an animal, right? He had been so much living by himself, he was sort of living like an animal. And that's just a reminder that actually we need to be with other people to live truly human lives. And we know that in our own lives anyway, we need other people for self-discovery, right? To know our strengths and weaknesses. We need other people in our lives to really help us to grow and flourish. We see that with the children. The children can't do life by their own. They need parents to help them flourish, right? So relationship is vital to human flourishing. It's how God has created us. And because God has created us as a relationship, right, not merely as individual, it has meant that God has given us gifts and capacities to help us enrich each other's lives. He has made us be people who are able to connect and enrich other people. And of course, that affects how we see our gifts, isn't it? That the gifts God has given you, they are not just for you, they are for enriching the society around you and even your family members, of course. And so we should be giving ourselves really to use those gifts God has given us to grow, to use them in the lives of others. So the true Christian then should be at the forefront, isn't it, of helping our fellow man, because we understand that being a true human being isn't just being an individual, it's about being in relationship. We are at our human best when we are doing life with others, when we are living in fellowship. And so, of course, midweek fellowship is when we are together, worshiping God together, doing life together. So Genesis 5 verse 1 is reminding us here that of the goodness of God in creating us in the image of God. We've looked at that, but also creating us in relationship, male and female, right? Even that element, I haven't talked about marriage, but marriage actually is, of course, at the heart of that, isn't it? It's one relationship that emerges, that God has given us, a fundamental relationship, of course, in society, but one among other relationships that also we have, isn't it? We are dads, and we are co-workers, and we are fellow members. So we live in a world of relationship. Okay, that's all part of the goodness of God, and we should thank God that man is created as a relationship. Is that clear there? Is there anything I've said there that's not clear that I can clarify before I move on to the third thing? The third thing is that God created man with a blessing. Again, there's a lot we can say here, but it's also there in verse 2. I don't want to say much because we need to move on. Man, male and female, he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. But notice that point there, that he blessed them, right? The blessing we know. What is this blessing? We know it from Genesis chapter 1. Let's go back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28 to 30. Verse 28 to 30. On the first, it's on page 1. That's the blessing that Moses is talking about there in chapter 5. And God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." And God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food." 4 blessings there, quickly, just to mention them. The blessing God gave us. First of all, He blessed us to be fruitful and multiply, right? That is to say, God gave us the capacity to reproduce, have children, and then thrive on the earth, and to pass on the image of God to their children, right? Secondly, God blessed us to do what? To fill and subdue the earth, right? The original word for subdue is kabash. It means to bring to bondage, right? That means to unlock and cultivate the resources that God has given us, right? But it's more than that. We are to develop the potential. In effect, we are to build a God-glorifying culture. So this is what is called the cultural mandate. Thirdly, God blessed man to have dominion over creation. And this dominion, we read about it in Psalm 8, right? It's dominion over all the works that God has given us. Genesis chapter 2, verse 15 talks about that dominion in terms of work, and to serve, to keep it, to guard it, to preserve it, to do work on the earth. So it's all part of this cultural mandate, right? Finally, God blessed man with food, right? The blessing of food is repeated in Genesis 2 verse 9. What's that about? Well, that's just simply saying that on top of being fruitful, on top of having this capacity to dominate and subdue the earth, God gave us, bountiful provision. God gave us provision. He gave us everything that we needed. So Genesis 5 verse 1 to 2 is reminding us of the goodness of God in creating us with a blessing of fruitfulness, the blessing of dominion, and the blessing of provision. And so, as we think about these truths, Moses really wants us, what's the children of Israel and us, to be thankful, isn't it? And even as tonight, as we come to pray later, let us pray and be thankful to God for these blessings that He has given us. Even in our fallen state, God still gives us that fruitfulness, and God still has given us this cultural mandate, and God is still providing for us. Let me say the fourth thing, then I'll open up for any questions. God created man under God's authority. So first of all, Moses wants us to see God created man in His image. Moses wants us to see that God created man as a relationship, and then God created man with a blessing, and then the fourth and final thing is that God created man under God's authority. Look at Genesis 5 there and what it says there at the end of verse 2. Male and female He created them, and He blessed them and named them man when they were created. Okay? So you might say, where's the authority there? Well, it's in the naming, right? We are told when God creates man, He names him, right? Naming in Genesis is a symbol of authority. When God creates, He names. We see that throughout Genesis chapter 1. But we also see Adam naming, right? Adam names Eve. Adam names the animals, right? Authority in Genesis is exercised through naming, right? And so what we're being reminded here is that man was created to live under the responsibility of God. This responsibility to God is being rooted in being a creature of God. And so God names us. This is the first time we're told in the Bible that it is God who gave Adam the name Adam. We have heard about Eve being named by the husband, Adam, but we are told God names man. And you see how that authority works, isn't it? God names the man then names the woman, and that's how it works, right? So man is owned by God, right? And therefore man is accountable to God, we are being told. Human beings are dependent and answerable to God. And this is our most important relationship in life. All other relationships are regulated by this. To be human is to love God, right? And to answer to Him above all else. To trust and obey Him. To pray to Him. This is why we are here this evening, even to pray. But it also means that to live coram Deo, isn't it? To live before the face of God in everything we do. So, just to summarize, the good creation here we are seeing is really showing us actually that man is bound to God in everything that man does. We are like fish with water, right? When you take out the fish out of the water, it loses life and it loses freedom. And in the same way, God created us to live under His authority. Of course, when we rebelled against God, we were trying to be like a fish jumping out of the water, right? And as a result, we lost life with God. But God, by His grace, has come in Christ to restore us and give us that life with Him. I just want to say, by the way, that the crisis of fallen humanity is a very simple one. What is wrong with the world? What is the problem human beings have? Well, it's the problem of authority. Who are you responsible to? That's the question. Who are human beings responsible to? And the Bible here gives us a clear answer. We answer to God. We exist to pursue His purposes. Okay? So the most important question you're facing this evening, regardless of what's going on in your life, it is simply this. What is God's purpose for my life? What is God's purpose for my life? What is God's purpose for this situation I'm in? What's God's purpose for me as a dad? What's God's purpose for me as a church member? What's God's purpose for me as a daughter, right? What is God's purpose for me as a citizen in the country? That's the question. It's not what does the government think, what does mom and dad think. I think those are important things. But actually, what does God think? Right? That's the question we need to be answering in our lives, in whatever situation we are in. Anyway, wrapping this all up, just to summarize, in verse 1 to 2, Moses is reminding us of the good creation of man by our good Creator. Before Moses gives us this full record of how God kept his promise. And we've seen those four things. We've seen that God created man in his image. God created man as a relationship. And God created man with a blessing. And God created man under his authority. And next week what we'll do is we'll look at the genealogy in more detail to learn how our good Creator kept his promise to preserve a line of salvation in a sinful world. But before, that's for next week. For now, I'll just open it up for next 10, 15 minutes. Next 10 minutes even. Any questions on that before we sing a hymn and then get into some praying?